night the Duke of Ravensshire arrived at Thornley Manor, Lady Aloan Harcourt locked her stepdaughter in the east wing. Not with chains, with omission. The invitations had been sent weeks ago, the musicians hired, the crystal polished until it gleamed like ambition itself. Every servant had been instructed carefully. Miss Cecily was to be presented. Miss Cecily was to be admired. Miss Cecily was to become a duchess. And Seraphina Vale was not to be seen. From the narrow window of her attic chamber, Seraphina watched the procession of black carriages curve along the frost-silver drive. Candlelight flickered below like a constellation gathered for someone else's destiny. She pressed her fingers to the cold glass and told herself, as she had told herself for years, that invisibility was protection. It was safer to be forgotten. Safer to let her beauty-blessed stepsister smile beneath chandeliers while she remained upstairs with ledgers and dust and silence. Downstairs, the Duke stepped from his carriage, tall, dark-coated, carved from restraint. A man known for discipline. For precision. For marrying wisely. He had come, society believed, for the beautiful one. But as he handed his gloves to a waiting footman, his gaze lifted. Not toward the grand entrance. Not toward the lantern-lit doors thrown wide in welcome. But toward the east wing. Toward a single attic window. And though Seraphina did not know it yet, he had not come for the girl being paraded below. He had come for the one they tried to hide. The east wing of Thornley Manor had once housed guests of distinction. Now it housed silence. Seraphina Vale stood barefoot on the narrow rug beside her writing desk, sleeves rolled to her elbows, candle guttering low beside an open ledger. Below her, music drifted faintly upward, violins tuning, laughter swelling, the murmur of servants moving quickly. The Duke of Ravensshire had arrived. She dipped her pen into ink and continued correcting the columns her stepmother believed no one noticed. Wheat yields misreported. Tenant payments rerouted. Maintenance funds diverted. Lady Aloan Harcourt believed beauty secured futures. Seraphina believed numbers did. But numbers were rarely invited to dinner. A sharp knock struck her door. Not polite. Not gentle. Mrs. Whitlow entered without waiting. The carriages have filled the drive, the housekeeper said quietly. Your stepmother has given strict instruction. Seraphina smiled faintly. That I am indisposed? Mrs. Whitlow's lips tightened. That you are not to leave this wing tonight. There it was. The familiar erasure. Seraphina closed the ledger. Of course. Mrs. Whitlow hesitated. You might have made an impression. On a duke who seeks a bride with a flawless smile. Seraphina shook her head gently. I possess neither the smile nor the inclination. The housekeeper's eyes softened. You possess far more than they deserve. When the door closed again, Seraphina crossed to the narrow window. Below, the manor blazed with gold light. Guests spilled across the marble steps. Laughter shimmered in the winter air. And then, a carriage darker than the rest rolled to a stop. The footman opened the door. He stepped out slowly. Tall. Measured. Wrapped in black wool and restraint. His Grace, Alastair Beaumont, Duke of Ravensshire. Even from this height, she could sense something different about him. He did not pause to admire the facade. Did not smile at the assembled welcome. He scanned. Evaluated. As if the entire evening were a negotiation. Lady Aloan descended the steps with Cecily at her side. Cecily glowed beneath lantern light, pale gold silk, pearls threaded carefully at her throat, hair arranged in deliberate innocence. She curtsied. Perfect. Practiced. Seraphina watched the Duke bow in return. Then, his gaze lifted. Past the welcoming arch. Past the musicians. Past the open doors. Upward. Toward the east wing. Toward her window. Serafina froze. It lasted only a second. Perhaps less. But she felt it, the distinct sensation of being observed. Not as ornament. Not as absence. As presence. She stepped back instinctively, heart betraying her with a sharp, unexpected rhythm. Downstairs, the doors opened. The Duke entered. And Thornley Manor exhaled as if history were being written. The dining hall glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Serafina could not see it, but she knew the choreography. Lady Eloan would seat Cecily at the Duke's right. Ensure laughter fell precisely where required. Guide conversation toward lineage and alliances. She returned to her desk. But she did not reopen the ledger. Instead, she listened. Wind carried fragments of sound upward. Applause. Glass clinking. Muted admiration. She told herself she felt nothing. She had learned long ago that longing was a liability. Her father had once told her she possessed the sharper mind. Lady Eloan had told her sharpness cut prospects. The choice had been made without her. And yet, that glance lingered. As if he had been searching. The thought was absurd. Dukes did not search for girls in attic windows. They chose perfection presented before them. Below, the first toast began. Alastair Beaumont stood slowly, lifting his glass. His voice carried clearly even through layers of stone. To Thornley Manor, he said evenly. To prosperity, and honesty. A strange word choice. Lady Eloan's laugh rang bright and quick. Honesty is the foundation of all prosperity, Your Grace. Indeed, he replied. And the foundation of sound estates. A pause. A subject of particular interest to me. Serafina's spine straightened. Estate management. Lady Eloan preferred not to discuss details publicly. Cecily attempted to redirect. The gardens are our pride, Your Grace. And the tenant farms, the Duke asked lightly. Silence shifted beneath the music. Serafina moved back toward the window without thinking. She could not see faces clearly. But she saw posture. Lady Eloan had gone still. Our steward manages such matters, her stepmother said smoothly. And he does so adequately. Adequate, the Duke repeated softly. An intriguing standard. A murmur traveled through the hall. The Duke set his glass down. I have found, he continued calmly, that estates often reflect not the steward's hand, but the owner's oversight. Serafina felt something electric move through her. He was not here merely for a bride. He was assessing. Testing. Lady Eloan recovered quickly. My late husband left the estate in excellent condition. I am certain he did. A pause. And since? There it was. A direct challenge wrapped in courtesy. Serafina exhaled slowly. Downstairs, Cecily laughed too brightly. The Duke must forgive our dull talk of crops. Surely London conversation proves more stimulating. Alastair's response came measured. I find crops far more honest than London. The line landed like quiet thunder. Serafina almost smiled. Hours later, when the music swelled into dancing, she remained in the east wing. But she no longer felt erased. She felt aware. Aware of a mind downstairs asking questions. Aware of a presence that did not conform neatly to Lady Eloan's design. And she knew something else with sudden clarity. If he had come merely to admire Cecily, he would not have mentioned honesty. He would not have probed accounts. He would not have looked toward the east wing. A knock sounded again. But this time, it was not Mrs. Whitlow. The handle turned slowly. Serafina stiffened. The door opened. And standing in the threshold, still in formal black, Still composed. Still impossibly deliberate. Was the Duke of Ravensshire. He removed his gloves slowly. "I beg your pardon," he said calmly. "But I was told no one resided in this wing." His eyes moved to the ledger on her desk. Then to her. And this time, he did not look away. Serafina did not move when the Duke stepped fully into the room. She did not curtsy immediately either. It was not rebellion. It was shock. He closed the door behind him with deliberate quiet. "I was informed," he repeated evenly, "that this wing was unused." His gaze swept the chamber. The narrow bed. The worn rug. The single candle. The open ledger. Serafina found her voice. "It is unused," she replied calmly. "For guests." A flicker passed through his expression. "Not amusement. Recognition. And you are?" "Serafina Vale." She curtsied then, not deeply, not theatrically. "Correct. Stepdaughter to Lady Harcourt." "Ah." A quiet syllable, but weighted. His eyes moved again to the ledger. "You keep accounts." It was not a question. "Yes." "For whom?" "For accuracy." That earned the faintest shift in his mouth. He crossed the room slowly. Every movement controlled, economical, like a man accustomed to entering spaces that did not belong to him and making them his. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the ledger. Serafina hesitated. Not because the numbers were incorrect. Because they were not meant to be seen. "You may," she said finally. He stepped beside her desk. Close enough that she could catch the faint scent of leather and winter air clinging to his coat. His gloved finger traced down the columns. He did not skim. He read. Carefully. His brow lowered slightly. "These figures do not align with the statements presented downstairs." "No." "You corrected them." "Yes." "You did not alter the original." "No." Silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was analytical. "You understand agricultural yield variances?" he asked. "My father insisted I learn." "And Lady Harcourt?" "She insists I do not discuss it." The words left her before she could soften them. He looked at her then. Fully. "You were excluded from dinner intentionally." "Yes." "And yet you watch." "I observe." His gaze sharpened slightly. "Why?" She met his eyes directly. "Because Thornley is not merely a stage for marriage negotiations." It was the first moment she realized how dangerous honesty could be. He studied her in stillness. "You believe it is mismanaged." "I believe it is presented selectively." A faint inhale. Measured. "And you believe I noticed." "You mentioned oversight." A pause. "And honesty." His gaze did not waver. "And what do you believe I came here for, Miss Vale?" She could answer safely. "Say Cecily. Say alliance. Say society." But something in his posture demanded truth. "You came to evaluate." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Yes." She did not smile. "Then you have." He closed the ledger gently. "I have begun." Below them, laughter swelled from the ballroom. Music shifted into a waltz. The performance continued. Up here, something else had begun. "You are aware," he said carefully, "that my presence in this wing would be considered improper." "Yes." "You are not alarmed?" "No." "Why?" She considered. "Because you have asked only about numbers." A faint, almost imperceptible exhale. As opposed to asking why I am hidden." The air between them changed. He stepped back slightly. Why are you hidden? She did not answer immediately. Because the answer was simple. And devastating. Because I am inconvenient. Silence deepened. He did not rush to contradict her. Did not offer false reassurance. Instead, he asked. Inconvenient to whom? My stepmother's design. And what is that design? To secure the estate through Cecily. He nodded once. She is suitable. She is beautiful. And you? It was not flirtation. It was assessment. I am practical. A faint flicker again. And if practicality were what I required? She felt her pulse shift. That depends on whether you intend to require it publicly. That earns something new. Not amusement. Respect. Footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor. Serafina stiffened. He heard them too. Lady Harcourt will not approve, she said quietly. I have noticed she approves selectively. The footsteps passed. He did not move. Tell me, he said softly, if Thornley were yours alone, what would you change? The question struck deeper than she expected. No one had ever asked her that. Not even her father in his final years. She stepped toward the desk. Opened the ledger again. Tenant relief in the West Fields. Why? Flooding reduced yield by 1/3. And the steward? Reported drought. His gaze sharpened. You have proof. She turned pages. Pointed to columns. Rainfall logs. Grain output. Discrepancies. He absorbed it silently. And in that silence, something shifted irrevocably. He was no longer looking at her as an inconvenient daughter. He was looking at her as an equal mind. If you're beginning to sense what Lady Harcourt has not, that the Duke did not come for beauty alone, then stay with this story. Because what happens when truth is revealed in a ballroom full of witnesses will change everything. He closed the ledger slowly. You should have been downstairs. Why? Because you are the only one in this house who understands what it stands upon. Her breath caught, not at praise. At acknowledgement. You cannot say that publicly, she warned. Why? Because my stepmother will not forgive it. He stepped closer again. And would you? The question disarmed her. Forgive what? If I chose honesty over performance. Her heart thudded once. Hard. You assume that is a choice you are willing to make. He studied her carefully. You assume I am not. A knock struck the door. Sharp. Authoritative. Serafina stepped back instantly. The handle turned. Lady Harcourt stood in the threshold. Her smile was exquisite. Her eyes were not. Your Grace, she said sweetly, we feared you had lost your way. Alastair turned calmly. On the contrary, he replied. I believe I have found something of interest. Lady Harcourt's gaze moved to the ledger. Then to Serafina. Cold calculation. I trust my stepdaughter has not burdened you with trivialities. On the contrary, he repeated softly. She has been most illuminating. The word hung in the air. Illuminating. Not decorative. Not charming. Lady Harcourt's fan snapped open. If your Grace wishes further entertainment, Cecily is waiting. I will join her shortly. But he did not move immediately. He held Serafina's gaze one final moment. Measured. Intentional. And in that look, she understood something dangerous. He had not come for the girl she tried to hide. And he was no longer pretending otherwise. Lady Aloan Harcourt did not raise her voice once the Duke returned downstairs. She did not need to. Her displeasure moved like perfume, subtle, invasive, unmistakable. Cecily resumed her position at the Duke's side with radiant composure, though a faint crease lingered between her brows. "You disappeared," she said lightly. "I was exploring," Alistair replied. "I trust you did not find Thornley lacking." "On the contrary," he said evenly, lifting his wine. "I found it, layered." The word slid across the table. Layered. Lady Harcourt's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her glass. Conversation resumed, but something fundamental had shifted. The Duke no longer performed admiration. He observed. He asked questions. And this time, they were precise. "How long has the Westfield drainage required repair?" Silence. Cecily blinked. "I'm afraid I do not oversee such matters." "Of course not." He turned calmly. "Lady Harcourt? Our steward handles maintenance. And you approve expenditures?" "Certainly." "Then you are aware tenant complaints have doubled in the past year." The air thinned. Guests shifted subtly. Lady Harcourt's smile did not falter. "I cannot imagine where you obtained such figures." "I prefer to imagine," he said coolly, "that they were not obtained by accident." Across the hall, at the balcony railing above the ballroom, Seraphina stood unseen. Mrs. Whitlow had quietly unlocked the east wing. Not out of defiance. Out of loyalty. From above, Seraphina watched the table. Watched the Duke dismantle illusion with courtesy. Watched her stepmother recalibrate. Watched Cecily shrink slightly, confusion replacing practiced charm. And for the first time in her life, Seraphina felt visible. Not because she was seen physically, but because her mind had entered the room. The dancing resumed. Cecily and the Duke took the floor. Perfect posture. Perfect rotation. Perfect distance. But there was no current between them. Only choreography. Seraphina turned away. She should not feel anything. This was not her arena. This was never meant to be her story. But then, the music ended. Polite applause. And instead of requesting the expected second dance, the Duke stepped back. Looked up. Directly toward the balcony. Toward her. The room followed his gaze. It was subtle. But undeniable. Lady Harcourt noticed immediately. Her fan snapped closed. "Seraphina," she said sharply from below. "Join us." The command was not invitation. It was containment. All eyes shifted. The invisible daughter descending the staircase. The murmur rippled like silk. Seraphina moved with quiet dignity. Stone gray gown. No jewels. No attempt to compete. She stopped at the edge of the ballroom. Curtsied. "My apologies." "For what?" the Duke asked evenly. "For existing in an inconvenient wing." A ripple of restrained laughter. Dangerous. Lady Harcourt's eyes flashed. The Duke stepped forward. "Miss Vale," he said clearly enough for the nearest circle to hear. "Would you walk with me?" A walk. Not a dance. Not possession. An equal movement. Gasps sharpened. Cecily's fingers tightened at her sides. Lady Harcourt moved instantly. "Your Grace, surely Cecily will rest," he said calmly. And extended his arm. Seraphina hesitated. This was the threshold. Step forward, and there would be no retreat into shadow. Refuse, and she would remain erased. He did not rush her. He waited. The entire ballroom suspended. If your heart is pounding right now, if you can feel the weight of that choice, this is exactly where stories turn. And if you want to see what happens when a hidden daughter steps into the light and a Duke risks everything for it, subscribe to this channel now. Because the next moments will change Thornley forever. Serafina placed her hand lightly on his arm. The ballroom exhaled in shock. They did not dance. They walked. Once. Across the floor. Through candlelight and whispers. Past Cecily's frozen smile. Past Lady Harcourt's tightening composure. When they reached the far archway, he spoke quietly. You understand what this does? Yes. You may withdraw. No. That was the moment. Not the walk. Not the gasps. The refusal to retreat. Behind them, the social fabric of Thornley began to fray. And Lady Eloan Harcourt understood something she had not anticipated. The Duke of Ravensshire was not merely evaluating a bride. He was evaluating control. And she was beginning to lose it. The wedding took place 3 days later. Not because it was desired. Because it was efficient. There was no extended courtship. No public celebration. No romantic anticipation. Sebastian Vale did not delay transactions. And Augusta Whitcomb did not want time for rumors. St. Bartholomew's Church stood at the edge of the village, its stone walls worn by centuries of wind and whispered confession. The pews filled early. Because word had spread. Not of love. But of debt. And everyone in that parish understood that marriages tied to debt were rarely gentle. Helen stood in the small vestry room, staring at herself in the mirror. The gown was ivory. Not extravagant. Structured. Clean. Measured. It had been delivered from London that morning. Alongside a note. Dignity requires no embellishment. S.V. She read it twice. Then folded it. Mrs. Fenwick adjusted the veil. You look composed, Mississippi. I feel aware, Helen replied quietly. That will serve you better. Outside, the church bell rang once. Clara stood beside Augusta in the front pew. Clara wore pale blue. Augusta wore deep plum. Defiant colors. The villagers watched. Whispers circled like smoke. Sold the estate. Blackthorn owns the debt. Augusta miscalculated. Sebastian arrived last. Dark coat. Measured steps. No entourage beyond his solicitor, Mr. Reeves. He did not look triumphant. He looked precise. When Helen entered the aisle, silence fell completely. Not because she was radiant. Because she was steady. Her gaze did not search for approval. It did not seek Augusta. It rested forward. Sebastian met her halfway down the aisle. Unusual. Symbolic. The Reverend began. The vows were traditional. But the air was not. When it came time to speak her name, Sebastian's voice did not waver. Helen Margaret Whitcomb. He did not shorten it. He did not rush it. He said it fully. When she answered, her tone was clear. Yes. Not breathless. Not hesitant. Deliberate. If you're watching this and thinking this is just another Victorian wedding, look closer. This isn't romance. It's power shifting in real time. Stay with it. Subscribe, because what happens after this ceremony will rewrite everything Augusta thought she controlled. Lady Eloan Harcourt did not sleep that night. Serafina knew because she heard the pacing. Measured. Controlled. Back and forth across the drawing room beneath her chamber. The sound of a woman recalculating. By morning, the household had shifted. Servants moved more quickly. Doors closed more sharply. Conversations lowered when Serafina entered. And Cecily. Cecily no longer smiled at her. Serafina found her stepsister standing in the morning room, pale gold silk exchanged for something more subdued. She was staring into the hearth though no fire burned. "You embarrassed Mama," Cecily said without turning. "I walked," Serafina replied quietly. "With him?" "Yes." Silence stretched. Cecily turned slowly. Her beauty was still breathtaking. But this morning it was edged with something new, uncertainty. "Do you think this is a game?" Cecily asked. "No." "Then what is it?" Serafina searched her sister's face. "I think he is asking questions." "And you are answering them?" "Yes." Cecily's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. "He is meant to choose wisely." Serafina felt that word land between them. "Wisely. Do you believe I am unwise?" she asked gently. Cecily's expression flickered. "No," she said after a pause. "I believe you are difficult." The honesty almost made Serafina smile. "And you are effortless." "That is not an insult," Cecily said sharply. "I did not mean it as one." They stood in quiet understanding for a moment, not enemies, but not allies either. Cecily's voice softened. "Mama says you confuse him." "That is not difficult," Serafina replied. "He is not accustomed to contradiction." Cecily stepped closer. "And are you?" "No." That was the truth. By noon, Lady Harcourt summoned Serafina to the study. The door closed with deliberate quiet. "You will remain upstairs for the remainder of His Grace's visit," Lady Harcourt said without preamble. "Why?" "Because last evening's display was unnecessary." It was a walk. It was a statement. Serafina did not flinch. "By whom?" Lady Harcourt's gaze sharpened. "You mistake yourself." "No," Serafina replied softly. "I believe you mistake him." A flash of temper sparked behind Aloan's carefully composed eyes. "You forget your position." "I remember it perfectly." "And what is that position?" Serafina held her gaze. "The one you assigned me." Silence. Lady Harcourt moved toward the desk. "You will not speak with him privately again." "You cannot control that." "I can." "Not if he seeks me." The room tightened. Lady Harcourt's voice dropped. "Men of his standing do not seek inconvenience." Serafina thought of the balcony. Of the walk. Of the deliberate stillness in his eyes. "No," she said evenly. "They seek clarity." Lady Harcourt's hand struck the desk, not loudly, but enough. "You will not undermine Cecily." "I have done nothing." "You have existed." There it was. The rawest truth of all. Serafina inhaled slowly. "If existence is threat," she said quietly, "perhaps the foundation was fragile." The slap came without warning. Not hard. But precise. Serafina did not cry out. Lady Harcourt straightened immediately, composure restored. "You will remain upstairs." The dismissal was final. But dukes do not respond well to being managed. That afternoon, Alastair Beaumont requested a tour of the estate. Not the gardens. Not the drawing rooms. The West Fields. Lady Harcourt protested politely. "The ground is muddy." "I prefer mud to marble," he replied. The steward was summoned. Cecily insisted on accompanying them. Serafina watched from her window as they rode out. Watched the Duke dismount. Kneel in soil. Examine drainage lines himself. Watched him turn slowly toward the manor. Toward the east wing. He knew. He knew she was not permitted to join them. That evening, when the party returned, there was no music. No dancing. Only quiet tension. Dinner passed carefully. Measured. Until he placed his fork down. "Lady Harcourt, he said evenly, I will require access to Thornley's full ledgers tomorrow. The steward stiffened. Cecily blinked. Lady Harcourt's smile was flawless. Of course. And I will require Miss Vale's assistance. The air fractured. I beg your pardon. Lady Harcourt asked softly. She appears to understand the estate better than any steward I have encountered thus far. Seraphina felt every eye in the room. Lady Harcourt's voice remained gentle. My stepdaughter is not involved in management. That is unfortunate, the Duke replied. Because she will be. It was not shouted. It was not dramatic. It was simple authority. Cecily's fork clattered. Seraphina lowered her eyes, not from shame. From awareness. This was escalation. Public. Deliberate. Lady Harcourt leaned forward slightly. You overstep. He did not blink. I invest. The room understood. This was no longer courtship. It was evaluation. And he was choosing substance over display. Later that night, Seraphina returned to the East Wing. Her cheek still burned faintly. She opened the ledger again. But her hands trembled. Not from fear. From something more dangerous. Hope. A knock sounded softly. Not sharp. Not authoritative. Measured. She opened the door. He stood there again. No gloves this time. No performance. Are you harmed? He asked quietly. She blinked. What? I noticed. Her hand rose unconsciously toward her cheek. It is nothing. His jaw tightened. It is not nothing. Silence passed between them, thicker now, more personal. You escalate, she said finally. Yes. Why? He stepped slightly closer. Because I do not tolerate false accounting. She almost smiled. You speak of land. I speak of you. The words landed cleanly. No flourish. No seduction. Recognition. You should not, she whispered. Why? Because my stepmother will not retreat. Nor will I. The quiet certainty in his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. Do you understand what this becomes? She asked. Yes. And I do not choose lightly. He studied her as though memorizing something. Tomorrow, he said softly, we correct more than ledgers. And for the first time, Seraphina felt the ground shift beneath Thornley Manor. Morning broke cold and merciless. The kind of winter light that revealed imperfections without apology. The ledgers were brought to the long oak table in Thornley's study, stacked, bound, heavy with years of selective accounting. Lady Eloan Harcourt presided at one end like a queen defending territory. The steward stood beside her, pale. Cecily remained near the window, silent. Seraphina entered last. She wore no gray today. Not bold color either. Deep blue. Unadorned. Intentional. The Duke of Ravensshire stood at the center of the room. Coat removed. Sleeves rolled once. Authority quiet but unmistakable. We will begin with the West Fields, he said evenly. The steward swallowed. The flooding was unavoidable. The flooding was predictable, Seraphina corrected softly. Every head turned. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened the ledger. Drainage maintenance was postponed 3 times. The steward's eyes flicked toward Lady Harcourt. Funds were reallocated, he said weakly. To what? The Duke asked. Silence. Seraphina turned pages. Interior renovations, she said calmly. Lady Harcourt's voice cut in. Hospitality is an investment. Not when tenants lose harvest, the Duke replied without heat. The room chilled further. Cecily finally spoke. "Mama, is this true?" Lady Harcourt's composure tightened. "It is complex. It is arithmetic," Seraphina said quietly. The Duke's gaze moved to her. Not to silence her. To steady her. The steward faltered under continued questioning. Discrepancies surfaced. Delayed repairs. Inflated reports. Nothing criminal. But everything careless. And for the first time, the illusion of effortless prosperity cracked. By afternoon, word had spread. Servants whispering. Guests exchanging glances. Lady Portman requesting her carriage earlier than planned. The Duke had not come merely to court. He had come to audit. That evening, the ballroom was reopened. But the air felt different. Heavier. More watchful. Cecily stood at the top of the staircase in pale rose silk, softer than gold, less triumphant. Seraphina remained near the columned archway. Visible now. Not hidden. The Duke entered last. Conversation lowered automatically. He crossed the room without hesitation. To Lady Harcourt. "Tomorrow," he said calmly, "I will finalize my decision." The word landed like a bell. Decision. Not courtship. Not exploration. Choice. Lady Harcourt's smile returned, brittle but intact. "We look forward to it." Cecily's fingers tightened on her fan. Seraphina did not move. The musicians began to play. 1 dance. 2. Polite. Controlled. Then. The Duke turned from Cecily mid-conversation. And walked toward Seraphina. Not hurried. Not dramatic. Deliberate. The room inhaled. "Miss Vale," he said clearly. "I require your counsel. Not your hand. Not your beauty. Your counsel." It was more intimate than a dance. They moved to the edge of the ballroom. Whispers followed like smoke. "You escalate further," she murmured. "Yes." "Why?" "Because they must see." "See what?" "That value is not decoration." Her pulse quickened. "You risk offense. I risk clarity." She looked out at the room. At Cecily. At her stepmother. At watching eyes. "You cannot undo this," she said quietly. "I have no intention of doing so." A beat of silence. Then. "Tomorrow," he continued, voice low enough only for her, "I will ask you something." Her breath caught. "What?" "You will answer honestly. And if my answer is inconvenient, then it will be correct." The music swelled. Across the ballroom, Lady Harcourt's gaze sharpened into something harder. This was no longer subtle. This was alignment. And it was visible. Later that night, Cecily found Seraphina alone in the corridor. "Do you love him?" Cecily asked bluntly. The question stunned her. "I barely know him." "That is not what I asked." Seraphina hesitated. "I respect him." Cecily's shoulders dropped slightly. "He was meant for me." Seraphina did not deny it. That was assumed. Cecily's eyes shimmered with something close to hurt. "Mama says you are confusing him." "Am I?" "Yes." Seraphina held her sister's gaze. "Perhaps he prefers clarity to choreography." Cecily did not answer. But doubt had entered her. And doubt spreads faster than gossip. That night, the East Wing felt different. Not like exile. Like a threshold. Seraphina stood again at the narrow window. Below, lanterns dimmed one by one. Tomorrow. He would choose. And when a duke chooses publicly, he does not merely shift affection. He shifts power. The question was not whether Lady Harcourt would fight. The question was how far she would go. Lady Aloan Harcourt moved first. She always did. Before breakfast had fully concluded, before the Duke had formally requested a private audience, invitations were drafted. A small gathering that evening. Select guests only. An announcement. Cecily was dressed in white. Not bridal white, but close enough to suggest inevitability. Seraphina learned of it from Mrs. Whitlow. They are preparing champagne, the housekeeper whispered grimly. Before he has spoken. Seraphina closed the ledger slowly. She is forcing it. Yes. Seraphina stood. If he intends to choose Cecily, then tonight merely hastens what was coming. Mrs. Whitlow's eyes softened. And if he does not? Seraphina did not answer. Because if he did not, tonight would shatter Thornley. The ballroom was smaller this evening. Intimate. Strategic. Controlled. Lady Portman returned eagerly. Lord Hawthorne lingered with interest. The steward stood near the wall like a man awaiting verdict. Cecily descended the staircase in luminous ivory silk. Perfect. Fragile. Hopeful. Seraphina remained at the back of the room. Visible. But distant. The Duke entered last. Black coat. Unadorned. Expression unreadable. Lady Harcourt stepped forward with radiant poise. My friends, she announced lightly, raising her glass. It brings me immeasurable joy to share news that will secure Thornley's future and strengthen bonds between noble houses. Cecily inhaled sharply. The Duke did not move. His Grace has honored our family beyond measure, Lady Harcourt continued. And it is my pleasure to announce. I have not yet spoken. The words were not loud. But they cut cleanly through crystal and expectation. Silence collapsed over the room. Lady Harcourt's smile froze. Your Grace, she asked gently. He stepped forward slowly. Measured. You announce on my behalf. I merely anticipated. You anticipated incorrectly. The temperature shifted instantly. Cecily's hands trembled. Seraphina's pulse thundered in her ears. Lady Harcourt recovered with frightening speed. Surely, she said smoothly, there is no confusion. The alliance between Ravensshire and Thornley is obvious. Yes, he replied calmly. It is. Hope flickered again in Cecily's eyes. Then he turned. Not toward Cecily. Toward the back of the room. Toward Seraphina. The movement alone was seismic. Murmurs broke out. Lady Harcourt's fan snapped open like a blade. Your Grace, she said warningly. But he did not look at her. He crossed the ballroom. Each step deliberate. Guests parted instinctively. Seraphina felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her. He stopped before her. Close enough that only she could hear the first words. I will ask you now. Her breath caught. He turned slightly so the room could see his profile. Miss Seraphina Vale, he said clearly. I have spent 3 days observing this household. Every word carried. I have seen beauty presented. A flicker toward Cecily. I have seen hospitality extended. A nod toward Lady Harcourt. And I have seen accounts examined. His gaze returned to Seraphina. But more importantly. A pause. I have seen integrity. The room inhaled as one. I will not marry performance. The statement fell like a stone into still water. I will not marry presentation. Lady Harcourt's composure cracked for the first time. You insult my daughter. I clarify my choice. Cecily swayed slightly. Lord Hawthorne muttered something under his breath. The Duke extended his hand. Not forceful. Not commanding. "Miss Vale," he said steadily. "Will you walk with me into a future built on truth rather than arrangement?" The phrasing was intentional. Not yet a proposal. But unmistakable. Serafina felt every eye. Every breath. Every possible consequence. Lady Harcourt stepped forward sharply. "She is not suitable." The Duke did not look at her. "That is not your determination. It is my house." "For now," he replied evenly. Gasps. Cecily's eyes filled, not with rage. With stunned realization. Serafina's heart pounded violently. "This destroys Thornley," Lady Harcourt hissed. "No," he said calmly. "It restores it." He waited. And in that waiting, he gave her power. If she refused, he would withdraw. If she stepped forward, the fracture would become permanent. The ballroom held its breath. Serafina lifted her chin. And placed her hand in his. The sound that followed was not applause. It was rupture. The moment Serafina's hand settled into his, the room ceased to breathe. Lady Eloane Harcourt stepped forward first. "You will release her," she said sharply. Not a request. A command. The Duke did not tighten his grip. He simply did not let go. "I will not. You embarrass us. I expose you." The words were precise. Controlled. Devastating. Murmurs erupted. Lady Portman leaned toward Lord Hawthorne with undisguised hunger for scandal. Cecily stood motionless near the staircase, the ivory silk of her gown suddenly too bright against the darkening mood of the room. Lady Harcourt's voice softened, a dangerous shift. "You misunderstand household management as deception." "I misunderstand nothing," he replied evenly. "Your steward misreported yields. Tenant relief was diverted. Repairs postponed. And the only person in this manner who corrected those figures was the one you can find upstairs." Every eye turned to Serafina. Not as ornament. As revelation. Lady Harcourt's composure finally cracked. "She is untrained. Emotional. Unsuitable for a duchess." Serafina felt the sting, but she did not lower her gaze. The Duke stepped half a pace closer beside her. "Unsuitable," he said calmly, "because she thinks." The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. "I require a partner who understands foundation, not facade," he continued. "I require a woman who values integrity above admiration." He turned fully toward Serafina now. And for the first time, his voice lost its formal detachment. "Miss Serafina Vale, you have been hidden, diminished, and dismissed. Yet you stood. You spoke truth when it was easier to remain silent. I will not ask you in private what deserves to be declared in public." The room trembled with anticipation. "I ask you now, before every witness gathered here, will you become Duchess of Ravensshire and stand beside me not as decoration, but as equal?" A gasp tore through the ballroom. Cecily's breath hitched. Lady Harcourt whispered, "No." Serafina's heart thundered so loudly she wondered if the entire room could hear it. This was no longer survival. This was choice. And in that suspended moment, she understood something with crystal clarity. He was not rescuing her. He was recognizing her. She stepped forward fully into the candlelight. "I will," she said clearly. Not trembling. Not hidden. "I will stand beside you, but never behind you." A murmur of astonishment rippled outward. The Duke's expression shifted, not triumph, but something deeper. Relief. Respect. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips against her knuckles. Not possessively. Reverently. If you have ever felt unseen, if you have ever been told you were too quiet, too inconvenient, too much or not enough, this is the moment stories are written for. And if you want more stories where the overlooked become undeniable, where truth breaks through manipulation, and where love is chosen boldly in the open, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Because what happens after this night will change Thornley forever. The final words had barely settled when Lady Harcourt moved again. You think this secures you, she hissed at Seraphina. You think marriage will erase disgrace? Seraphina faced her stepmother calmly. No, she replied. But honesty will. The Duke's voice cut across the room. Effective immediately, I will assume oversight of Thornley's estate until its management stabilizes. The steward will remain under review. The steward paled visibly. Lady Harcourt's fan snapped closed with violent precision. You overreach. I invest. Again that word. Final. Cecily finally moved. She crossed the room slowly, ivory silk whispering against polished floor. Her eyes were bright, not with rage. With realization. You never intended to choose me, she said quietly to the Duke. He did not insult her with false regret. I intended to choose wisely. The honesty hurt. But it was clean. Cecily looked at Seraphina. For a moment, the sisters held each other's gaze without pretense. You were never invisible, Cecily whispered. You were hidden. Seraphina felt the truth of it settle. Hidden. But no longer. By the time the guests departed, Thornley was no longer the same house. Whispers would spread by morning. Some would condemn. Some would admire. But none would forget. Lady Harcourt stood alone near the staircase as the final carriage rolled away. You believe you have won, she said quietly. The Duke did not respond. Seraphina did. This was never a game. For the first time since Seraphina had known her, Lady Harcourt looked uncertain. Control had been her language. And tonight, someone else had spoken louder. Outside, frost silvered the drive once more. The Duke offered his arm. Not for display. For partnership. Seraphina took it. And together they stepped out of Thornley's doors, not into scandal. But into consequence. Morning at Thornley did not feel triumphant. It felt exposed. Sunlight moved through the east-facing windows without permission, illuminating dust that had always been present but never acknowledged. Servants worked in near silence. The steward avoided eye contact. And Lady Aloan Harcourt did not descend for breakfast. Seraphina stood at the long table in the study with sleeves rolled again, but this time not alone. The Duke stood beside her. No ballroom. No audience. No performance. Just ledgers. This will take weeks, he said evenly, scanning columns. Yes. You may withdraw from it. No. He glanced at her. You owe Thornley nothing. I owe my father clarity. That answer satisfied him. They worked side by side. No flirtation. No soft glances. Precision. By midday, the pattern was undeniable. Funds diverted to cosmetic renovations. Inflated event expenditures. Neglected tenant infrastructure. Nothing illegal. But everything strategic. Lady Harcourt entered at last. Dressed impeccably. Composed again. I assume, she said coolly, that you intend to humiliate me thoroughly. The Duke did not rise. Correction is not humiliation. It is when done publicly. Seraphina closed the ledger gently. No one forced an announcement, she said quietly. Lady Harcourt's eyes sharpened. You believe yourself vindicated. No, Seraphina replied evenly. I believe Thornley will survive. A silence stretched between them, different now. Not dominance. Not rebellion. Transition. Lady Harcourt exhaled slowly. You mistake control for cruelty. And you mistake concealment for protection, Seraphina answered. For the first time, Lady Harcourt did not retaliate. She simply looked tired. Cecily will require stability, she said quietly. She will have it, the Duke replied. She is not without prospects. No, he agreed. She is not. Lady Harcourt's gaze shifted to Seraphina. You were always your father's daughter. And you were always strategic, Seraphina returned gently. It was not forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement. Lady Harcourt turned. And what becomes of Thornley now? The Duke's voice was steady. Shared oversight. Transparent management. Tenant relief implemented before winter ends. Lady Harcourt absorbed it. And me? Seraphina answered before he could. You may remain. That surprised everyone. Including the Duke. You built this house into what it is, Seraphina continued. It deserves continuity. Not erasure. Lady Harcourt studied her stepdaughter with something unreadable in her eyes. You are not naive. No. And you are not weak. No. A faint nod. Small. But genuine. Then she left the room. Not defeated. Diminished. But aware. Later that afternoon, Cecily found Seraphina in the winter garden. The frost had not yet melted. Glass panes held condensation like quiet tears. You pity me, Cecily said abruptly. Seraphina turned. I do not. You took what was meant for me. I took nothing. Cecily's breath trembled. He never looked at me the way he looked at you. Seraphina did not soften the truth. No. The honesty hurt, but it was clean. Cecily sank onto the stone bench. I was raised to be chosen. And I was raised not to expect it, Seraphina replied. Cecily let out a weak laugh. How strange we both were unprepared. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Cecily straightened. I will not be whispered about. You will not be, Seraphina said calmly. There are men who admire light without depth, Cecily added. And there are women who prefer admiration to examination. Cecily managed a faint smile. Do not condescend. I would not dare. A pause. Will you be happy? Cecily asked. Seraphina considered carefully. I will be respected. Cecily nodded once. That may be better. That evening, the Duke found Seraphina alone in the East Wing. But the room felt different now. Not confinement. Origin. He stepped inside quietly. You offered her mercy, he said. She offered me survival once. Did she? Yes. He absorbed that. You did not speak of the slap, he said evenly. Seraphina did not flinch. It does not define me. It defines something. Yes, she agreed. A silence passed. Not tense. Not uncertain. Do you regret it? He asked. Standing beside me. She stepped closer. No. Even knowing the scrutiny that will follow? Yes. He exhaled softly. For a man accused of choosing impulsively, I find I am unusually certain. She studied him. You were not impulsive. No. No. You were deliberate. And you? I was finished being hidden. The simplicity of it moved him more than dramatic confession would have. He reached for her hand, not to claim. To connect. I do not promise ease, he said quietly. I promise partnership. That is all I require. And Thornley? Will become honest. He nodded once. And Ravenshire? She met his gaze. Will become shared. A slow warmth settled between them. Not heat. Not urgency. Foundation. Outside, frost began to recede under the faintest touch of winter sun. The east wing window no longer felt like exile. It felt like memory. And Serafina understood something fully now. Being chosen publicly was powerful. But choosing to remain, knowing the cost, was stronger. Winter did not end abruptly. It receded slowly. Like pride. Like fear. Like illusion. By the time the wedding invitations were sent, Thornley had already begun its quiet transformation. Tenant repairs were underway. Drainage corrected. Ledgers aligned. Transparency had replaced presentation. Lady Eloan Harcourt supervised the winter pantry inventories with renewed precision, no longer defensive, no longer theatrical. She had not apologized. She had adjusted. Cecily received invitations of her own. Not from dukes. But from men who admired warmth without requiring submission. She accepted one in particular, Lord Edmund Fairfax, who preferred conversation to spectacle. Thornley no longer revolved around a single future. It stabilized around truth. The wedding was not held at Thornley. It was held at Ravensshire Chapel. Stone older than vanity. Windows taller than ego. Light pouring through stained glass in quiet authority. Serafina did not wear white. She wore deep sapphire blue. Unadorned. Unapologetic. When she entered the chapel, no one gasped. They watched. And in their watching, something shifted. She was not the hidden daughter anymore. She was the woman chosen. Alastair stood waiting. Not rigid. Not guarded. Present. The vows were simple. Clear. I take you, he said evenly, voice carrying through the chapel. Not as adornment to my title, but as foundation beside it. A murmur passed gently through the pews. And I take you, Serafina replied, steady and unflinching. Not as escape from obscurity, but as partner in what we build. There was no hesitation. When he placed the ring upon her finger, he did not rush. When she did the same, she did not bow her head. They looked at one another. Fully. Seen. By spring, Ravensshire began to change as Thornley had. Tenant councils implemented. Revenue reinvested. Cosmetic renovations paused in favor of structural repair. At council meetings, Alastair introduced her not as my wife, but as Her Grace. It was a subtle distinction. But posture shifted. Respect followed. Not because she had married well, but because she stood well. Months later, Lady Harcourt visited Ravensshire. Not as overseer. As guest. She walked the fields quietly. Observed the drainage channels. Listened to tenants speak without fear. When she stood beside Serafina overlooking the west boundary, she did not offer criticism. You were right, she said simply. Serafina did not savor it. You were careful, she replied gently. And you were courageous. A single nod passed between them. The last fracture sealed. Years later, when their daughter asked how they met, Serafina would smile slightly. He was meant for someone else, she would say. And Mama, the child would ask. I was meant to be unseen. Alastair would look at her across the room with the same deliberate steadiness. And then, the child would insist. Serafina would meet his eyes, the same way she had in that ballroom, steady, unafraid. And then, she would say. He chose to look closer. Outside, spring would stretch endlessly over Ravenshire's fields. Inside, Two people who refused to accept what was assigned to them built something stronger than expectation. Because being overlooked does not mean being unworthy. And being chosen publicly is powerful. But choosing yourself first, that is unstoppable. And if you stayed through this entire story, if you stood with Serafina when she was hidden, when she was doubted, when she was slapped, when she stepped into that ballroom knowing she could lose everything, then don't disappear now. Subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this deserve to be seen, just like she did. And if you scroll away without subscribing, the next girl standing in the shadows might never hear the story that tells her she doesn't have to stay there. Choose to stay. Choose to support stories where the unseen become undeniable. Subscribe, and step into the light with us.